Good morning. I'm here to talk today about no-till corn. Dan had approached me, not knowing ahead of time what they were calling a presentation, planting green. Sometimes that's a connotation of having a cover crop and planting green into it, but my focus, what Dan wanted me to talk about, was no-till corn. Planting green could also be environmentally friendly. That's usually what is tied to the word green also. So my focus is on no-till corn production, or that practice. I titled my presentation Lessons Learned, because that's how I learn things. I learn them the hard way. So it's a system. You got to think through the whole season, from harvesting the fall before, through planting, the growing season, fertility, all of that. Um, No-till corn has a big advantage when it comes to equipment savings and labor. So always keep that in the back of your head. If you commit to it 100%, that's a big issue on the bottom line. Not an issue, but a savings on the bottom line. So I'll talk about the agronomics, the equipment, crop rotation, and cover crops as all part of the system. So starting out years back, I had a 6-row planter and I put Rawson coulters on it. It was a 3-coulter system. Probably didn't work the best for our heavy clay soils. I actually took 1 coulter off shortly after getting them and just run 2 on each side of the row, which kind of amazingly is now kind of what they preach, is putting starter on both sides of the row. So 40 years ago, the guy was ahead of his time. But moved on from that. Early on, no-till corn, I tried it, went away from it like a lot of guys did. I started paratilling for a while, lightly working it down smooth. It was more stale seed bed at that point. Went back to strip till then after that, which is what you see a picture of here now. And it's an easy transition process. Strip till is kind of like a stale seed bed then at that point. Early on, I was just plain strip till with not much cover crops, but on some farms I was doing cereal rye, which that's what this is here. It's a good place to start. It's easy to manage, easy to kill. The advantages of the strips is you get a little solar radiation on them, and your cover crops get in between, and sunlight dries it out a little quicker. This particular cover crop was spun on with a fertilizer buggy in the fall, and then the 6-row strip tiller I had has row cleaners on it. It would scoot the residue and the seed off of that row middle, I'll call it, where you're going to plant. And there was wheel traffic and stuff, kind of packed the seed down, and that's usually what I got always, was a nice clean strip with my cover crop in between. And that worked pretty good. Helped with the erosion. I still had erosion, and that's why I went away from it, is in just straight strip till in bean ground. On rolling ground, we'd get the conditions in the winter through January or February or March when we had that winter thaw and we had a rain event. It'd wash out all that thawed soil down to the frozen, what was froze underneath of it, and then you had a valley or a rut there. And if you had perfectly flat, level soils, it would be okay. But rolling ground, that's why I went away from it. So here's another part of the system. This is annual ryegrass, also seeded on with a spinner buggy. And this one I probably harrowed it in to get it established a little easier. Annual ryegrass can create some challenges in that it's a little harder to get established. You got to do it a little earlier in the fall. If it gets much past mid-October, you're probably getting a little late to get good establishment. It's harder to kill in the spring. It's got to be growing, and average temperatures have got to be up there so it takes the Roundup in if you want to kill it in one pass. It usually always took me 2 passes to kill it completely for whatever I was doing right or wrong. I don't know. But the big rewards behind annual ryegrass is the root system. Very prolific root system. It'll go down deep, break up that compaction if you're starting a no-till system. Doesn't allow for much solar radiation, especially if you got a good stand. The ground is shaded in the early spring, and I usually tried to kill it before I was ready to plant so that it was dead and dying, or at least dying by the time the planter rolled in. I didn't let it get too big. So another part of the system, if it was in a corn, bean, and wheat rotation, was medium red clover, which I usually frost seeded in when I was top dressing my wheat with nitrogen. And then it was growing already by the time you harvested the wheat and would grow all summer. And still had this bare strip. You get a little radiation on it, dried it out, planted like stale seed bed. And the clover, some of them say that was hard to kill, but I always used dicamba and didn't have any trouble killing the clover. That was all good. It's a legume which feeds your corn crop. Really got a good root system, and you get a lot of tonnage from top growth. So you're building a lot of organic matter there. I also, since I went away from strip till, I still do the medium red clover, but it's 100% no-till, which is a little harder to do because it's solid and you don't get that dry strip. So you just plain got to wait longer into the spring till the air temperatures warm up to help dry the soil out quicker and then plant. And then it works pretty good. But early in April, this type of condition is going to hold more soil moisture. But it also works for you later into the season when it's got more left there than when bare ground dries out. So this is another reason why I've got wheat in my operation. I use those fields for manure application in the summer, empty a hog pit, do that for custom work and put the manure on my farm or my own cattle operation. It's a green growing crop that will pull up the nutrients out of that manure, which usually happens the summer before, and then you plant corn the next year. So I just happened to take this picture one summer when it was a little wetter and we got some really good growth. Uh, Kind of impressive. So another part of the system is I guess maybe different methods of cover crop establishment that you want to think through in your system. I talked about spinning them on with the buggy early on there. I also use this Phoenix rotary harrow in bean ground, especially to harrow it in after I've spread it on, especially earlier in the fall when the ground's dry. It fluffs the residue. It's not a very aggressive tool, but it'll scratch the ground a half inch maybe, but it gets the seed laying on the ground. And versus taking a planter and planting directly, it's a little slower process because I've used my 15-inch row planter to plant my wheat and cereal rye as a cover crop. If I'm not putting it on with the spinner buggy and harrowing it in like this. As conditions get wetter or later, maybe I don't use the harrow. Maybe then at that point I'm just running the buggy out there, getting my cover crop spun on. And for cereal, in the case of cereal rye, it usually always comes. You might have to up your rate a little bit. Early on in the season, I might start out at 30 pounds, and if it gets down into November, I might be up at 50 or 60 pounds of cereal rye per acre. But when it gets wetter and later, you can do it with less compaction with these lighter tools and still get something established. So just something to think about as part of the system. This is the latest idea I've tried, is putting my cereal rye in 30-inch rows and planting it. It's maybe more geared towards a beginner that's looking at no-tilling corn, and if they want to include cover crops, it gives you a wider window for a bare soil condition to plant into. That maybe if you're just doing it with a conventional planter that you're doing all the rest of your tilled ground with, do this once your fields are dry. A conventional planter with rubber closing wheels will work in bean ground just perfect, and you can still have some cover crop there with the benefit of the roots. You're getting this solar radiation that I've talked about, so it's a little easier management. Like I said, or look there, planter settings are easier to manage. And I talked about, I've also used my 15-inch row planter to accomplish the same thing. So this here is a picture of that air cart that I use. It's a Montag air cart, which initially is for fertilizer injection with this toolbar. It's set up on 30-inch rows. That's actually what I use to side dress the fertilizer on my corn with then, and or put some fertilizer on in season. But I can also use it in the fall for something like cereal rye and just fill the box up with that. If you're doing annual ryegrass, you might have to have a carrier because it's got too big of meter rolls in there for fertilizer to run annual ryegrass. So you might have to come up with a carrier like pelleted lime or gypsum or something like that, or even fertilizer. But planting versus surface application is always going to help your cover crop establishment, but it's a tool in the arsenal depending on what the weather gives you to do. Just something to think about. So now we'll go on and talk about equipment. This was one of the planters I had prior to my present one. I've always used one planter to plant all my crops. It's a 15-inch row planter. You're doing corn and beans with one planter. So I'm going to talk about planter attachments for no-till conditions. I've always used spiked closing wheels with drag chains and a seed firmer. No-till colders, like I mentioned there at the beginning, I did have them on my very first 6-row planter. I took them off of that pretty shortly. My later ones never had any no-till colders on. I've never been able to use row cleaners because it being a 15-inch row planter and all of the row units on it, there just isn't much room to hang extra equipment on it. And I've gotten along fine without row cleaners, so it is what it is. So this is just a current planter picture, but I want to talk about fertilizer placement in no-till corn. I had one 30-inch row planter at one time that had factory frame mounted fertilizer colders up front. They were heavy duty. They worked fine. They got it in the ground. But when I had my 15-inch row planters, I had to go to a unit mounted colder, which wasn't as good. They won't get your starter as deep. I had problems with them not getting the starter fertilizer in the ground in a cover crop situation. Then the planter gauge wheels here would pick it up and make a mess of the planter. So when I wore out the units I had on this planter, I went to a unit that actually extended my closers here, and that didn't work. I tried that one year, that didn't work. So now I went to this, which is just a simple splitter. Y drops your starter fertilizer behind the planter, and I've got them set so it goes right in behind that spoked closing wheel trench that it's making. And I'm using a 28, a little 1034 thiazole mix on each side of the row, and then the drag chain will drag it in a little bit. It gets a little messy, but don't hurt that. I'm not concerned about that. But that's the story on starter fertilizer attachments that I've tried. If you have a 30-inch row planter, maybe frame mounted. So a little bit about agronomics. I threw a picture of a soil map up here, soil type map. This particular field of mine has 8 different soil types in it and 60 acres. And when you plant them or go to plant, they're all going to dry out a little bit different time. You know, it might only be a day or two difference, but there's a difference there. And your moisture line might be at different levels if one's drier than the other. So you get, you don't want to lay your seed in dry soil and in wet soil. So keep that in the back of your mind. We'll get to that later, but soil type, tile drainage, and deeper compaction layers when you're beginning to start no-till corn. Just things to keep in the back of your mind. Wetter soils will stay colder. That's where I keep bringing up solar radiation. If you can manage cover crops to allow for a little of that. When it comes to agronomics, it's just, you hear guys talk and they talk about accumulated growing degree units and planting into a good accumulation window. It takes 120 growing degree days or units to get a corn plant to emerge, if I read my sources right. So 4 or 5 days, if everything's perfect, that spike should be poking through the ground. And planting depth to get that all to emerge even is so important in no-till corn production. This next one here, I'm talking about the same thing, but soil moisture and sidewall compaction. And I mentioned a little about the planting depth and the even emergence that leads to, and that's what you really need. So that if you're planting and your soil is crumbly dry, down to 2 inches is a good target. And obviously with varying soil types, maybe you're starting a day or two too early and you're going to have some spots where it's a little tackier. That's where those spoked closing wheels come in for planter attachments. It can mitigate a little of that for you, but if that's all done right, that transition phase from the seedling roots to the nodal roots, once they get out and growing, you're past the biggest hurdle of no-till corn. It took me a lot of years to realize that. You pack the corn row open when it's damp, and you pack it closed, and then you come back a week later and it hasn't rained, and your ground's dried out and shrunk, and you can walk down the row and see that sprouted kernel, and you can see the seed, and you've probably lost 15 bushel an acre on your yield that way. So just them lessons learned the hard way. So this here picture's got a little bit of annual ryegrass in when I was trying that. And this is dead, but you've got regrowth right here, a little bit down here. I always had to spray it twice to keep it in check, and that's kind of why I personally went away. So that's it for the major part of the agronomics and the really key points I wanted to stress there. Cover crops are another really important part of the transition phase. That's why the beginning slides of the system all included cover crops. So in a corn bean rotation, your type of cover crop you want to plant, the timing of seeding, or maybe even interseeding is something that we're trying now or looking at, some guys. Doing that in V3 to V6 or 8 in corn. Getting your cover crop actually started in season. Thinking about when to terminate it. And after the wheat crop, if you're in a corn and bean and wheat rotation, that opens up your possibilities for a whole lot of other options for cover crops, from brassicas, radishes, turnips, clovers, buckwheat, a lot of those different things. So corn and bean rotation, I kind of prefer cereal rye myself now. It usually, you can plan for it regardless of what the weather gives you. You can throw it out there mid-November and usually it'll take and grow. So if the money's coming out of your pocket, that's kind of what I look at, is to lean towards something that I know I'm going to have some success with. And I mentioned early on about the timing of seeding, depending on what the weather allows, and so cover crops here, we also talk about a transition phase from full width tillage to no-till. I mentioned that a little earlier, but your soil density layers and how that affects soil moisture migration up and down the soil profile. In all of these examples, my first experiences in no-till were more without cover crops, so I was doing it without the benefit of the root mass that the cover crops are giving you to help alleviate that stratification that happens when you're first starting out in the system. Once you're into it, a couple, 3, 4, 5 years, especially in cover crops starting out, it greatly speeds that process up, because years back, the guys used to say when you were starting to no-till, you were talking 7 years maybe till these density layers would totally be gone and you would reap full benefits. So first, like I said, manage the agronomic side of understanding how to plant no-till corn and do that right. Then understand how you can add cover crops and take advantages of the root mass and the top growth to build organic matter so that the ground dries quicker in the spring when you don't have these density layers. When that soil line, the soil moisture migrates earlier in the spring, at 8 o'clock in the morning, it might be on the surface, but by 1 in the afternoon, it may have dried down. Finally, I just threw this slide up to when I take on a new farm. This was one of the last ones my brother bought in 2016. So I just have 4 years on it now, 4 crop years. I'm into it. And I just wanted to use this as an example. 2016, the previous tenant had chopped corn silage off of it, rutted it up. It was really wet when he did that. It was a mess. But fortunately, it got dry later in October, so we chiseled it, worked it down, got it in shape and leveled. And then going into 2017, I no-tilled my corn in that spring. That was June the 7th, and I just put the planting dates out here on the side for reference. Second year, I didn't include any cover crop yet, but second year we no-tilled beans and harvested them, and they were planted on 5/8, pretty decent yields. This is pretty good dirt. It was systematically tiled with clay tile back in the, I'm guessing 40s or 50s, but it does have a system of clay tile in, but it's got some depressions, so if it rains hard, it's got some ponding holes in it that are slow to drain, mainly because its outlet is in the Flat Rock Creek, which is around Hoagland, and it's really slow to drain when you get heavy rains. It takes a long time for that creek to empty out, and then your tile will finally drain. But at any rate, after the second year beans, it was late on harvest because they were a full maturity bean. So